Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. Of course, as soon as I promise on this channel a little bit more consistency in my postings and my videos, trying to make it a goal to make a video weekly, I suddenly get bogged down in some of the busiest times of my life and can't really hold up to that promise anymore. But that's just how life goes sometimes, and nevertheless, I am glad to be back. And because of how busy I am and how busy life is right now, I have decided to debut a sort of new series to my channel that I think will really help alleviate some of my stress. As much as I love doing the individual album reviews and the episodes of the Critical Corner where I can break down my thoughts on 4 different albums in a little more detail, I do still want to talk about more music and more movies that I've seen. I have decided to make things a little more simple for myself, that I am debuting a new series where I will be doing quicker reviews, and this is the first episode of the quick album reviews version. There's also going to be a quick movie review version of this same series as well coming soon, and this will be sort of a test run to see how well this works and how easy it is for me to put these things together. Now, these will be a little less structured than my Critical Corner episodes or my movie and music individual review episodes would be. I'm not going to have as many video clips playing, if any, and it's just going to be my very quick thoughts on them. In this series, I'm going to keep it a rule to break down my thoughts on 10 pieces of music or 10 pieces of movies in a much more short and concise manner than I would on the Critical Corner or on my individual album or music reviews, album or movie reviews. And like I said, they will be less structured and there's not going to be as much editing put into these. So, let's go ahead and get started and talk about the first album that I have heard. So, the first album I'm going to be discussing in this video is Wolves at the Gate's latest album, Eulogies. I believe this is their 4th or 5th album. I can't remember at the moment. I'll put it in editing which one it is once I try to figure that out. But Eulogies is yet another great release from this band. I was a huge fan of Eclipse. I think it was their best album by far, and Wolves at the Gate has been one of those rare bands where I view that they have improved on each of their albums consecutively. With each release, they've gotten better and better. Now, with Eulogies, while this is a great album, I will say this is the first time in their history, in my opinion, where it hasn't been as good as the album coming before it. I do still think Eulogies is probably their second best album still. This album is superb, and it's one that I have returned to time and time again this year already. It has the typical addicting Wolves at the Gate quality to it. It's really great metalcore while also still staying true to what they were doing on Eclipse and experimenting with their sound further. They tried new things on here, they tried a lot of different sounds, and I think it worked for them to great effect. There are so many great highlights on here. The opener, Shadows, was one that I was initially not sure what I thought about it, but as I heard it more, and especially in the context of the album, it quickly became one of my favorites. Kiss the Wave stuck out as my immediate favorite. Honestly, it felt like Wolves at the Gate were inspired by While She Sleeps on this song, especially in how they composed their guitar work here. I think it's all too obvious that they were influenced by them, and they put their own spin on that influence, which I absolutely love. And it creates one of the most addicting choruses they've penned with some superb gang vocals that are just wonderful for them. I really hope that they pursue this style a little more in the future. But once again, I'm glad that Eulogies tries a lot of different things. Peace Starts the War feels like something that could fit on their Shadows and Echoes album, and I say that as a compliment because I really like that album as well. Weight of Glory is just a huge banger, and while it maybe is a little cliched, it still is a lot of fun. Deadweight is a song that feels like a huge continuation of where Eclipse left off, and features one of the most beautiful choruses of the album. Overall, this album is just excellent. There aren't that many problems I have with it. I suppose there are a couple of songs that come across as forgettable to me. For example, White Flag is a little forgettable and I think is a little bit basic rock. And while I do think No Tomorrow has a really good climax and it ends off on a pretty memorable note, I think it takes a little too long for the build-up to really work. And for as beautiful as The Chorus of Lights and Fire is, it does just feel like a sort of typical radio rock anthem. Although I still do enjoy the song overall, I just have to acknowledge that it's maybe a little basic compared to some of the other tracks on here. But yeah, all in all, this is another great release from Wolves at the Gate, and will almost certainly be one of my favorite albums of the year. I really enjoy this. 4 out of 5 stars for me. An album like Set It Off Elsewhere is perfect for this series because I just really don't have much to say about it at the end of the day. Set It Off is a band that unfortunately I feel like has really lost their potential ever since Duality. I still think Cody is a really good lead vocalist. He has some huge talent. And while it's easy to compare him to Patrick Stump of Fall Out Boy, I do still really enjoy him as a vocalist, and I think he has a lot of charisma. It's just unfortunate that it's really drowned out by a lot of genericism on this album. There just isn't really that much that left me remembering anything on this album. The lead single, Projector, is probably the most memorable song here, which is unfortunate. I also like Who's in Control. I think that's a pretty fun song. And even the other lead single, Skeleton, was pretty good. But as a whole, this album isn't bad by any means, but I just can't really name a single other song besides those 3 that really left much of an impression on me one way or the other. Overall, it's just a very competent pop album, very average, very middle of the road, which I feel like isn't the Set It Off that I used to enjoy. That's not really who they were back in their heyday. They were a band who could do some pretty interesting stuff within the pop and rock sphere. But that's not really the case anymore, unfortunately. So with all that said, that's really all I have to say about this album, and I'm going to give it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is yet another album where I just don't have much to say about it. This debut album by wetlake got a lot of attention from critics. It seemed to be a very big critical darling and an early year gem for people. A lot of people are saying it could be one of the best debut albums of the year, but I honestly just don't see it. It's not a bad album, and there's a lot of likable moments on it. Chaise Lounge is great. I think that Your Mum is a lot of fun and has sort of a funny, snide feeling to it. And the closer, Too Late Now, is a really powerful moment on the album as well. But overall, I don't know. Something about this album isn't clicking for me. Maybe it's the way the vocalists almost sing in some of the lyrics. And I feel like production-wise, the instruments just don't really get much of a chance to pop off in this album much. They just are sort of there and they do what they're supposed to do, as do the vocalists, but nothing really stands out to me much. It's a competent album, and it's one that I wouldn't mind hearing in passing. It's not like I'd roll my eyes if you put it on. I'd enjoy listening to it, but it's just not one that I'd return to on my own just when I'm deciding what albums I want to listen to. I haven't returned to this beyond the couple of times I initially listened to it, and it's just not really an album that has stuck with me, sadly. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. I hate to call this one of the worst albums of the year, but that's what I'm going to have to do for Fit for a Country's newest album, which is titled What Are We Waiting For? Fit for King and Country is a band that has really fallen off. More appropriately, I should call them a duo, because it's a duo of 2 brothers who produce music within the Christian music sphere. Unfortunately, with their 3rd album, Burn the Ships, they really started being in danger of being generic, in my opinion. And with this album, I think they've totally fallen into that hole, sadly. Relate was an incredibly weak lead single, just something that left no impression on me whatsoever. And For God Is With Us tries to be essentially God Only Knows from their last album, but even worse. And I don't really like God Only Knows from the last album either, because that one was already pretty generic. But this one falls even deeper into that hole. And sadly, I think most of the albums here are just meant to populate the radio and just fill space on the Christian radio scene, which is unfortunately what a lot of these big CCM bands are doing these days. Overall, it just doesn't do much for me. It just feels very hollow, very forced. And if you like this type of music, I mean, I have no problem with you, but I just don't understand what the appeal is. It's just very middle of the road and dull. 2 out of 5 stars for this album. Together is the only track here, in my opinion, that is worth salvaging. Ghost is back with their next album, Impera. I was very excited for this album, especially coming off the heels of one of their best albums yet in Prequel, which was also coming off the heels with what is, in my opinion, their best album, Meliora. And yeah, this band had a lot of pressure under their belts, in my opinion, because they were coming off of the heels of two albums that were immensely successful and both had Grammy nominations. I know Meliora won, and I believe Prequel might have won as well. While this new album isn't, in my opinion, nearly as good as those past two, I still think it's very fun in its own right. On their last album, they were showing some signs of embracing a more theatrical version of rock rather than the darker metal that they had done in the past. And on this one, they embrace that fully. They go pretty much full glam metal on this album, in my opinion, which means a lot more cartoonish and over-the-top lyrics in places, as well as a lot more just bigger ideas and bigger feeling instrumentation. Kaiserion is one of their best openers, if not their best, honestly. It has huge power to it, and I love the sort of classic rock sounding vocal scream that begins off the song, and then the excellent guitar riffs. And then you go into Spillways, which is one of my favorite songs of the year so far. It just has this instantly iconic feeling to it, in my opinion, especially in the chorus. The way the pianos and the guitars combined together, it feels like an instant relic of something from the Bon Jovi era, for an example. It's just a song that is hard to resist, and one that I just can't help but love. Speaking of love, Darkness at the Heart of My Love is a great ballad. It's a power ballad through and through. It knows what it is, and it embraces it to full effect. And it is just such a great moment on the album, and I feel like it really explodes. And Watcher in the Sky. Oh man, talk about an epic track. I really love the places that this track goes to, and I think it stays constantly interesting. Even if its chorus is maybe a little bit predictable and doesn't have too much variation, this is still a very fun song. Now, I won't deny that this album has some cliches to it. Of course it does. It has some things that you are going to be able to see coming from a mile away, because it is pretty much a dedication to 80s glam rock in all of its crazy glory. And that does make for some moments that can be a little weak. I know a lot of people, a lot of critics especially, have panned 20s, and I'm not going to say I hate the song entirely. In fact, I wouldn't call it the weakest song on the album personally, because it's almost too fun for me to hate. It's one of those songs that I can't really hate because it just dedicates to what it's doing. But it's not one that I can call a favorite either, necessarily. Actually, probably the weakest song on the album would be Call Me a Little Sunshine for me, unfortunately. That was the lead single on the album, and I just wasn't ever really impressed with it. I think it took a little too long to get anywhere interesting, and even when it does get to the interesting stuff, it doesn't really stay that way for me, in my opinion. Also, there's a few too many interludes and stuff that I think break up the flow of the album more than add to it, and I feel like they could have just made those full songs to flesh the album out a little more. And I know a lot of people like Respite on the Spitalfields, or Spitalfields, I'm not sure which way you say it, but the song has some good moments, and I do like how it reuses some guitar riffs from other parts of the album to give it a sense of closure. But the song, I don't think, justifies its almost 6-minute length, at least in my opinion. But still, this is just a fun album. I don't really understand the people who say it's Ghost's worst, because it really doesn't feel that way to me. Sure, it doesn't have the dark metal feeling of their previous albums, and maybe it has some cartoony moments, but I think Ghost really dedicates to the style here, and I think they have some really catchy choruses and some really iconic moments here, especially in songs like Spillways and Watcher in the Sky. So for that reason, I'm going to give this album a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars. Following his super experimental album Boarding House Reach, Jack White continues to experiment on this new album, Fear of the Dawn, and for me personally, his experimentation works a little bit more on this album than it does on the last. And honestly, through and through, this album feels like it should have been released in October, in my opinion. It has a distinctly Halloween-y feel, in my opinion. All the songs feel like the product of a mad scientist is the only way I can really describe it. Nowhere is that more apparent than in a song like Taking Me Back, which was a superb lead single, and I really feel stands leaps and bounds above every song on here. There are other good songs on here, but Taking Me Back is superb and is one of my favorite songs of the year for sure. The guitar work in this song is excellent. It really jumps off the page, and Jack White really lets his voice soar to some amazing heights on this song. Heidi Ho, for as very bizarre as it is and very unpredictable as it is, still has a lot of fun moments in it as well. What's the Trick is a killer cut with probably the best guitar work on the album outside of Taking Me Back. I really liked what this song did and wish that there had been a couple other moments that had gone this crazy and this off the rails on the album, because this one, it just does not leave your mind with what it does. And that was then. This Is Now is probably the most conventional song on the album, and I did enjoy it despite all that. It works pretty well. Now, I will say that some of the experimentation on this album did turn me off a little, such as on Eosophobia. I didn't really care for what that song was doing, and Into the Twilight was using these vocal effects a little too much, and also, I think Overstayed Its Welcome is probably the weakest song on the album. But still, Jack White was clearly having a lot of fun here, and I think the album works as just something that is crazy out there, and I think it's perfect listening for the Halloween season personally. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. If you're a fan of artists like Phoebe Bridgers or Lucy Dacus, then Lizzy McAlpine is an artist that is definitely for you. I can immediately tell that she had those influences on this album, and while this album doesn't really give me the same sense of atmosphere as Punisher does, or the same devastation of the lyrics on Lucy Dacus's album from last year, I still really enjoy this release. I think it's excellent, and it's definitely one that is an early contender for me for albums of the best albums of the year, maybe even top 10 best albums of the year. It's that good. There are some wonderfully written lyrics on here that really delve into Lizzy McAlpine's frame of mind on her thoughts on love and mental health and everything like that. Doomsday is a devastating opener with some beautiful usage of strings along with acoustic guitar, and I love how it just continues to build and build the tension until it really releases to this height that is chilling to hear. And Ego Thing has almost this alternative rock feel to it that I really like. It goes for a bit more of an intense vibe that I would like to see Lizzy pursue in the future, because her vocals really work on a song like this. Erase Me is heartbreaking, with Jacob Collier providing some really good ghost vocals. And Reckless Driving is a super interesting song where it contrasts Lizzy McAlpine calling herself a safe driver that in a relationship, the fact that she doesn't want to take risks and she wants things to stay sort of the same, whereas her co-vocalist is the reckless driver in this case and is one that is wanting to try new things, and it creates a very interesting love story in the track. This album is just very well written from front to back. There's so many great lyrical moments that you really need to hear for yourself as you dive into this album, as Lizzy McAlpine is brutally honest on her feelings about many things, and she delves into herself in very honest ways as well, I feel. Great album, one of my favorites of the year already for sure. Very strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. Coming off of 2 crazy experimental albums that really pushed forward what could be done in the realm of hyperpop, Charli XCX is back with Crash, and she's made a more conventional pop album this time around, interestingly enough. Maybe she was wanting to do what she knew and what would be a little more comfortable this time around after doing all the crazy experimentation from her past 2 albums. Maybe she even wants to get a little bit more pop recognition in the mainstream, but nevertheless, even when she is making a conventional pop album, I think Charli does this sound better than a lot of her contemporaries. She's just really good at this particular sound, and she's going for these more trendy 80s grooves that have been popularized in this time and age. And while there are many songs here where you've definitely heard this sound before, I think Charli makes it work well enough. There's not really much else to say for this album in my opinion. I think it does what it does very well. It's a very fun album, and there's a lot of good highlights on here. I'm sure at least one of the songs on here will make my favorites, but there's so many to choose from that I don't really know what would, because a lot a lot of songs from the album are sort of rotating themselves between being my favorites. Right now, I would say the title track is my favorite, but there's a lot of other great tracks on here as well. And yeah, for that reason, this is a solid 3.5 out of 5-star album. It's not as good or as interesting as her previous two albums, Charli, or her album that came before this, but nevertheless, it's still a very fun album. Northlane continues to show themselves as a band that are willing to reach beyond the bounds of what is expected in metalcore and nu metal. They already did so on Alien, a very ambitious album that really embraced nu metal and metalcore combinations to great effect and was one of my favorite albums of the year it came out. Now, I will say that at the beginning of this album, they sort of settle you in comfortably before really going into the experimental stuff. Clarity is a song that you would expect out of Northlane, and I say that as a compliment, and this is one of my favorites on the album for sure. It is conventional Northlane, like I said, and it's something that you would easily hear on Alien, but man, the way that chorus explodes off the page, it is irresistible. And then we get into Clockwork, which I would call the promotional sort of lead single for this album. It wasn't even necessarily for sure that this was going to be on their new album, but I'm glad it ended up on this album anyway, because it is a very fun song, and you can feel the urgency in the song as the lead singer is saying over and over again, "I'm running out of time." Carbonized is a very timely song where the band calls out predators in the music industry, particularly in the metalcore industry. And if you hear the commentary for this track and them talking about it, they actually call out some people very obviously who they're referring to in this song, which is a pretty bold move. And it might make them disliked by some people in the metalcore scene, which is an unfortunate state, an unfortunate commentary on how things can be in the more toxic parts of this scene. But nevertheless, it is a very necessary statement, and I think Carbonized is probably my favorite, because not only is the statement here very relevant and very powerful, but the musicality reflects that, with a chorus that you can just feel their anger and their fury in it. It works so well. Zen is one of the most experimental songs on the album, and it's one where you're not going to really expect where it goes. It even has a sort of rock guitar solo in it that was very surprising, but I really liked what it did. And Cypher really goes for this almost EDM feel, this almost clubhouse EDM feel along with metalcore elements. And this is really, I feel like, the song that defines the album in many ways. This is sort of the sound that you're going to get on the majority of the album. It takes its time getting to where it needs to go, but when it does get there, I think the payoff is worth it. And then the title track, Obsidian, is superb. It has some of the most brutal Northlane screams I've heard in quite some time, and if that's something that you are missing from the band, then you are going to get that in spades in this title track. And overall, I really like what this album does. I know some people are probably not going to love this one necessarily because it has more of those EDM feels and almost like some dark wave influences as well, and it more takes its time with progressing its elements, and in some songs the payoff won't be necessarily what you were expecting, but I think if you open your mind up to what this album has to offer, I think it has a lot of good stuff in it. For that reason, I'm giving this a very strong 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, I wanted to talk about Rammstein's newest album, Zeit. And once again, this is an album where I don't have much to say. It's Rammstein. It's just another great piece of metal with some electronic influences in it as well. And the vocalist, once again, just has this very iconic quality to him. I don't think I've ever really heard another vocalist like him, and he just has this quality to him that makes you know that you're listening to Rammstein and no one else. And the combination of political and personal commentary here, once again, works. And while the album is still sort of repetitive in its choruses and saying the same things over and over like previous Rammstein albums, I do still enjoy it quite a bit. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this debut episode of Quick Album Reviews. Hopefully you enjoyed. Let me know if you have any suggestions for improvement for me. But hopefully I was able to break down my thoughts in quick enough form for you all on this, and hopefully you all understand why I have to do a series like this. I think it's just necessary for my own peace of mind, and plus I just like talking about as much as I can, and I think this series will help me talk about more albums and more movies than I would have been able to previously. So that is the goal of this series. But nevertheless, once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies on this channel, along with the occasional commentary piece. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel and looked out for future videos. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.